Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Wagner with the Justice Research and Statistics Association. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to this webinar on incident-based data as an analytical tool to address policy. It's part of a series of webinars hosted by JRSA to promote the sharing of information by the State Statistical Analysis Centers. Before we go any further, I also want to thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for making this series of webinars possible. All right, so you'll also see we've thrown up a poll there on the right-hand side. We just want to get a little bit of information on your background as we get started. You'll see that you may fall into more than one category, so just choose whatever is closest to your employment. And before we go into the presentation, I need to cover just a few logistical items. We will be recording today's session for future playback. The link to the recording and to the slide presentation will be posted on the JRSA website, and that link will be emailed to attendees once it's available. Today's webinar is being audio cast via speakers on your computer. If you do not have speakers or would prefer to use your phone, you can use the number in your registration email or on the event tab in the top left-hand side of your screen. There are many people joining us today, so we have automatically muted the lines of participants to reduce the background noise. If you are not a presenter, please keep your phone muted. If you unmuted your phone, please type *6 to remute your phone now. If you have questions for the presenters, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen. After the presentations, we will have some time for some Q&A. Please select host and presenter from the drop-down menu next to the text box so that everyone can see your questions. You'll also see there's a Q&A section on the bottom underneath the chat. Don't use that. If you're submitting questions, please use the chat section. If you are having any issues or if you'd like to communicate with JRSA staff during the webinar, please submit a comment using the chat feature and select to host. This session is scheduled for 1 hour, 30 minutes, and will end promptly at 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. If you have any technical difficulties or you get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link that you initially used to join the session. You can also call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239, and I believe that phone number can also be found on the screen. In the last 5 minutes of today's webinar, we will ask you to complete a short survey. The information you provide will help us to plan and improve future webinars. All right, so let's get started. Today our speakers will be presenting research using state incident-based data. Both of these reports, among others, can be found on JRSA's Incident-Based Reporting Resource Center website, accessible from JRSA's main page. For more information, you can contact me at lwagner@jrsa.org. Full bios for all of our speakers will be available on JRSA's website, but I want to briefly introduce today's presenters. Our first speaker today will be Rob McManus, presenting on his report, An Overview of Racial Disproportionality in Juvenile Arrests and Offenses in South Carolina. Rob has worked with the South Carolina Statistical Analysis Center since 1992 and became the director in 1995. In that role, he has participated in research initiatives concerning domestic violence, gang violence, sexual assault, illegal drug use, and other justice-related issues. He served as research partner to the South Carolina District United States Attorney for Project Safe Neighborhoods from 2002 to 2012. Previously, he worked in research and evaluation with the South Carolina Department of Probation and Parole for 10 years, and earlier was a program evaluator with the Governor's Office of Criminal Justice Programs. He is currently co-editor of the Justice Research and Policy Journal and served on the JRSA Executive Committee, including 2 years as president of the association. He received a master's degree in criminal justice from the University of South Carolina and a bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our second presenter today is Max Schluter, who will be presenting on his report, An Analysis of Domestic Violence and Arrest Patterns in Vermont using Nieghbors data. Max currently serves as the director of the Vermont Center for Justice Research, the State Statistical Analysis Center, and is adjunct professor of Justice Studies and Sociology at Norwich University. Prior to his work at BCJR, Max served as the director of the Vermont Criminal Information Center at the Vermont Department of Public Safety for 16 years. During his tenure, he served as the director of Vermont's crime reporting system and was responsible for managing the State Identification Bureau, the Vermont Criminal History System, the Vermont Sex Offender Registry, and the state's National Crime Information Center program. He holds a PhD in sociology from Southern Illinois University. All right, Rob, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, I'm ready, and I'll go ahead. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking about our use of incident-based reporting to look at disproportionate minority contact among juveniles in South Carolina. As you might expect, and we have our first slide up there, as you might expect, and I don't think we're particularly exceptional in this regard, racial disproportionality in criminal justice is pervasive in our state. Among adults, incarceration rates are higher for blacks and minorities than for whites. Arrest rates are higher. Community supervision caseloads are higher. Pretty much everything is disproportionately black and minority versus white. When you look at juveniles, and we've been looking very closely and measuring racial disproportionality for some number of years at 9 different decision points in the criminal justice system and reporting that to OJJDP, we have found that, and this has been fairly consistent over the years, that racial disparity in arrest is more than twice that of the next closest decision point. There are 9 decision points: arrest, referrals to juvenile court, cases diverted, secure detention, filing of formal charges, finding of delinquency, probation placement, confinement in correctional facilities, and being waived to adult courts. But the disproportionality at the point of arrest is more than twice that of any of the other decision points. Unfortunately, although we know this and we have a long history of recording that, we don't know much else. We don't know if it varies by juvenile characteristics such as ethnicity, sex, the circumstances of the offense, such as offense type or location. We don't know if black kids are handled differently than white kids. There's a lot of opinion and anecdotes, and these have been issues that have been looked at very closely by a number of groups, but very little has been done to look more deeply at the situation, despite the fact it's been a very serious problem, and even despite the fact that this has resulted in a fairly short-lived finding of being out of compliance with OJJDP on this particular issue. So looking at the data sources, we employed 2 data sources. The first was census data. We got detailed population estimates for 2008 and 2009, which was provided by our branch of the Census Bureau, the Office of Research and Statistics down here. And you also need Nieghbors data, or we use Nieghbors data, which is Nieghbors compatible. We have 100% reporting in this state and have for many years, so we've been very fortunate in that respect. We use juvenile arrest and offenses for the same number of years. That data was provided by the State Law Enforcement Division. We have maintained a good and ongoing relationship with both of these agencies, which is obviously essential to any such sort of efforts. One thing I would like to point out, even though this study was undertaken in 2011, the 2010 Nieghbors data were not yet available, so we had to rely on 2008 and 2009. This is perhaps one of the drawbacks of having 100% reporting in your system because you are always waiting on the least reliable source of data at any given time. So to the next page, in defining racial and ethnic categories, we found that in order to comply with the OJJDP categorizations, we had to use a combination of racial and ethnic characteristics. Fortunately, both in the census data and in Nieghbors, ethnicity and race are measured differently. So what we did was put together 5 subpopulations: Asian non-Hispanics, Black non-Hispanics, Hispanics of all races, Native American non-Hispanics, and white non-Hispanics. We basically used ethnicity as a master category. If you were listed as being Hispanic, then your categorization was Hispanic. If you were listed as being non-Hispanic, we used the racial category to categorize the juveniles. Practically speaking, in South Carolina, blacks and Hispanics and whites are the major population groups, as we'll see in the next slide here. Our juvenile population is slightly more than 1 million. The age of criminal responsibility in our state is 16 or younger by statute. The racial ethnic distribution, using those categories as I defined them earlier, was as you see right there. White 57.8%, 32.7% black, and 7.4% Hispanic, the other groups being much smaller. One of the more interesting things we found in looking at this was that the Hispanic proportion of the juvenile population was a good bit higher than the overall proportion of the overall Hispanic portion of the population, which is approximately 2.4%. So for whatever reason, there are a lot more Hispanic kids. I'm sorry, I think I went ahead one. All right, I'm out of order. Measuring disproportionality, we use the relative rate index, which is calculated, as it says up there, by dividing the arrest or offense rate of interest by the rate for the comparison group. This RRI is pretty much mandated. We're required to use that by OJJDP in reporting disproportionality to them. And it's a fairly simple measurement to use. We use the white kids as the comparison group in all circumstances. And in that case, an RRI score less than 1, as you see, signifies a rate that's lower than white kids. An RRI score greater than 1 denotes that the arrest rate was higher than that for white juveniles. And this is a very important item here. The operational definition of arrest, and I think many people in our state did not understand this. An arrest report must be completed anytime a kid's taken into custody, regardless of whether he was released or not. Informal warnings and anything similar to that should still require an arrest report to be filed with Nieghbors. That's something that will become important as we go further on through the presentation here. So after we created our set there and everything and started looking at this, this is basically what we found. When you look at the race ethnicity groups that we created, we found a much higher rate of disproportionality compared to white kids for black kids, and slightly lower, actually lower arrest rates for other minority groups, Hispanic, Native American, and Asians. One thing to note, and I have this on the screen, is that all our rates are expressed at the rate of 10,000 for juveniles. That's just something we've always done in our state, partly out of habit, but partly also because with a lot of small and rural counties, we just simply found that expressing rates at a rate of per 10,000 made it much easier for people to understand than using the rate per 100,000, as is the case with the FBI statistics. So our next step was to see what effect gender had on disproportionality. And as you can see from this slide, it had virtually no effect whatsoever. Comparing white females to minority females, the rate was 2.2. Comparing males across the groups, it was 2.3 higher rates for minorities. Now, I will mention that I think we probably should have looked more specifically at this, as I did with the previous table, looking at black, Hispanics, whites, and comparing blacks and Hispanics to whites, but we didn't, and that was just simply a mistake of omission. For our next analysis, I created 7 hierarchical offense categories. Kids are often arrested with multiple charges, and Nieghbors collects up to 3 charges per arrest event. So for this analysis, I created this hierarchy, which you can see in descending order in front of you. If a kid was arrested for a serious violent offense, that was the master category, and so forth down the line there. Serious violent included murder, sexual violence, robbery, aggravated assault, kidnapping. Weapons offenses were simply offenses for illegal possession of weapons, not offenses involving weapons. The lesser violent offenses were included simple assault and intimidation. Property offenses was pretty much all inclusive. Drug offenses, any drug or drug equipment offenses fell into that category. Status offenses was ranked above the all other offense category simply because we did not want to lose the identity of status offenders in case they were charged with another very minor offense, such as disturbing the peace or disorderly conduct. And among all other offenses, which was the single largest group, nearly half were for disorderly conduct. So when we looked at disproportionality by offense category, as you can see for among black kids, in each and every offense category, disproportionality was evident. It was as high as 4.7 for serious violence offenses. The closest it came to being equal to the rate for white kids was among drug offenses at 1.3. Among Hispanics, for every offense category, the RRI was lower, which was in keeping with our earlier findings. So another question we had was, how are officers handling kids when they arrest them? How are they? What type of arrest are they subjecting them to? Is it the more coercive on-site or warrant type arrest, or are they simply getting tickets? And what is the difference based on race? And here it didn't seem to make too much sense to look at it in terms of the RRI. We simply looked at the percentage breakdown. And as you can see, white kids were ticketed a good bit more often, 50% more often than black kids, and somewhat more often than was the case with Hispanic kids. So I think based on this table, you can certainly make the case that the type of arrests that kids are getting that white kids are getting is somewhat more preferential than that for black or Hispanic kids. The next question we had was, well, you know, what kind of referral are they getting? And Nieghbors allows us to look at 2 different types of referral after arrest for juveniles. The first is an external, which includes events such as being sent to a detention center, to our Department of Juvenile Justice or the Department of Social Services. We interpreted that as being the more coercive type of referral, or internal referrals, which basically means they were released to their parents. These findings were a little less, there was, as you can see, almost no difference in terms of how the kids were handled on the basis of race. Black kids were slightly more likely to to receive an internal referral. Hispanic kids were somewhat less, and white kids fell between the two there, but essentially there's not very much difference at all there in those categories. Well, another question we had in our mind was, you know, how are these? What difference is there in terms of the situations that kids are arrested in? So the first question that came to mind is, where are they getting arrested? What sorts of places are kids getting in trouble in? So we use Nieghbors, which has, fortunately, a wealth of location codes, I think 27 or 28, somewhere in that area, and collapse those into 7 different categories. And as you can see here, private residences, which covers anything such as a condo, apartment, private house, any sort of place that is primarily a place of residence. And schools ranked first and second and accounted for almost 2/3 of all juvenile offenses. So what we knew from that was that there's two places that really hold a very large share of the juvenile crime market in our state. And then when we broke those down into relative rate indexes for both blacks and Hispanics, as you can see, once again, Hispanic kids have much lower arrest rates in all places, and black kids have much higher arrest rates in all places. But what we found particularly interesting was that disproportionality was very high in schools. It had the second highest level of disproportionality among these premise types, which seems to hold that out as an area of future interest. Another question we had and that OJJDP asks on a regular basis is, are there any particular jurisdictions or counties that are more egregious offenders in this regard than others? So we looked at it, and South Carolina has 46 counties. We found that in those 2 years, 2 of the 46 counties had an annual RRI of 1 or less for black juveniles, which is to say that there were 2 instances in which black kids had arrest rates that were equal to or lower than that of white kids. 42 of the 46 counties had annual RRIs of 2 or higher for black juveniles. And we had some pretty large ranges, as you can see, ranging from 0.6 to 12.7. Now, what we found is at both extremes, both low and high, these were very small rural counties where the difference of a few arrests really makes a difference in terms of the arrest rates among either of these groups. So you really even have to take the extreme values with a certain level of skepticism. It doesn't mean too much, particularly in counties with populations of under 20,000, which was the case for all these counties here. So in terms of key findings, and this first one, that Nieghbors provided no support for officer discretion as a factor in disproportionate arrest rates. This comes from the operational definition of arrest. If officers are in fact reporting these arrests as they're supposed to, then arrest rates themselves don't really tell us anything, at least in terms of how the individual officers are handling the situation. It certainly does not rule out the possibility of other, perhaps more systemic factors being at work there, but it does pretty much take individual officer discretion out of the equation. And that's important because that is really one of the areas that our various focus groups and committees have been really concentrating on and using as a point that needs to be remedied. Another key finding was that geography didn't really make any difference, as we just discussed. It's limited, and disproportionality is by no means concentrated in any particular area, not by type of county. Rural and urban and suburban counties were all exhibited high levels of disproportionality. It's really a statewide problem, is what that told us, not located in any particular single area, region, or county. We also found that disproportionality, and this was somewhat surprising, is a problem among black juveniles, but not among Hispanic juveniles. Hispanic juveniles, as we saw earlier, actually having lower arrest rates than white kids. we found that gender was not a moderating factor. That's very important because it was assumed that would be among many of our focus groups as well. When you look at the rates, it's clear that females of both the various racial and ethnic groups have lower arrest rates than males do. But when you look at the arrest rates, I believe that black females actually had higher arrest rates than white males did. And when you look at across racial ethnic categorization by sex, they both came out to be virtually the same. So we really didn't have any help there with disproportionality at all. Disproportionality was highest among violent offenses and lowest among arrests for drugs and status offenses. I'm not sure exactly what we need to make of that, but it's certainly very important, and it's something we're going to look at more closely. More than half of juvenile offenses were for either all others offenses, which is a category of mainly Group B offenses, relatively minor offenses, or property offenses. So we've got an awful lot of arrests of kids for relatively minor offenses. They're not to a large extent really serious offenses that they're getting arrested for. Nearly 2/3 of juvenile crime occurred at private residences or at schools. And to us, the finding that such a high proportion occurred at schools was very important, and something we intend to look at in greater detail in the future. And disproportionality was greatest for offenses at residences at schools, which kind of echoes the previous, it reinforces the previous point somewhat. So the implications we took away from this, particularly for future research, it's going to be very important for us to verify that law enforcement is adhering to juvenile arrest reporting requirements, i.e., are they actually doing as they're supposed to be doing and reporting all arrests as they should, which would include any catch and release type arrest, warnings, etc. If they're following the procedures, then that, in fact, takes out individual officer discretion as an important factor, and that's something that we've really been putting a lot of work into over the years. Second implication is that obviously a good bit more analysis needs to be done looking at disproportionality within offense categories. The categories we created, I think, were good gross measurements for a start, but probably not fine enough to really help us come up with some good policy related implications. And finally, and I think this is the big takeaway we had from this study, was that additional analysis needs to be done concerning particularly the disproportionality in juvenile crime at schools. What factors are really pushing that level of disproportionality, and what can we do about it in order to better improve our DMC situation? So that's certainly going to be our next target area in terms of analysis into DMC. We're going to hold questions until after Max does his, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank both JRSA and BJS for the funding that allowed us to do this. Thank JRSA for putting on the webinar, and to express my appreciation to SLED for always being so cooperative in allowing us ready access to the Nieghbors data. So thank you very much, and I'll mute myself out now, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Rob. Max, you have control of the slides. Are you up?
I am up. Can you hear me?
We can. You sound good.
Very good. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'd like to send you out a virtual welcome to Vermont. I thought you might find this photo interesting. I took it on Tuesday of the path up to my back door. It was a chilly, what we call brisk morning in Vermont at 10 below zero. So here's the pitch. If you haven't planned your April vacation, why don't you come on up? We got plenty of snow for great skiing, great sledding. I can guarantee there'll be plenty of ice to skate on. And this is a message that was brought to you by the Vermont Department of Tourism. So what I would like to do today is to first give you some background information and introduction on this project related to domestic violence, a high overview of the research methods, and then get into the specific analysis of domestic violence using key Nieghbors National Incident-Based Reporting System variables, and then speak about some policy analysis that we did regarding domestic violence arrest patterns, and particularly talking about arrest type, clearance, and then some regression analysis that we did to try to identify variables that would help predict physical arrest. So by way of introduction and background, this project was funded by JRSA as part of their IVR Resource Center grant. And again, I echo Rob's appreciation for this opportunity. This grant is an excellent opportunity for statistical analysis centers to develop research capability using Nieghbors or to help develop and expand your capability. I would highly recommend applying for it. When we decided for this project that it was going to be focused on domestic violence, we wanted to make sure that it was going to be policy relevant. So we convened a focus group of Vermont domestic violence service providers and advocates, and we asked them, what would be of value to you? And the first thing that we did, of course, was to explain the Nieghbors system, which was an excellent opportunity because you could just see people's eyes open and wheels going around in their head saying, gee, I didn't really know this data was available, and these are interesting questions that we could ask for. And once we conveyed to them what kind of data that we would be able to analyze, they were really interested in the who, what, when, where of domestic violence. So they were interested in who the victims were, who the offenders were, what kind of injuries there were, where there was concentration of these problems, because they wanted to develop their outreach and prevention programs in a guided way based upon who the proper audience for these trainings would be. They were also interested in information on arrest policies. Now, in Vermont, we do not have a mandatory arrest policy for domestic violence, and there was a certain amount of anecdotal information that police were not making physical or custodial arrests, but rather were using what we call in Vermont a citation, where the person is not arrested, not removed from the scene, but given a citation to appear in court. The concern of the domestic violence community is that we certainly know that domestic violence can escalate into some very serious incidents, including homicide. Now, we don't have a lot of homicides in Vermont, but the ones that we do are substantially domestic violence related. And so they were very interested in looking at this point. The other thing that was of concern to them was when the police clear a case, meaning that they pronounce that the case has been solved, they can do that either by an arrest or they can use what's called an exceptional clearance. And an exceptional clearance means we know who did the crime, but we didn't make an arrest. And there are several reasons for that. And one of the reasons is the victim refused to cooperate. So again, this was policy information that they were interested in having in order to, again, increase and think about policy for outreach. So by way of background, Vermont, similar to Rob, is a 100% Nieghbors statute, and we achieve that pursuant to a statute. We've been certified since 1994 as a statewide program by the FBI, and we routinely have 85 agencies reporting. And it wasn't until I put together this PowerPoint that I realized that we ought to be having a 20th anniversary celebration in Vermont. Maybe a parade, who knows, maybe at least a couple of press announcements to raise attention regarding Nieghbors. We access our Nieghbors data through Vermont Crime Online. And Vermont Crime Online is literally an online interactive analysis product which allows you to create custom tables on the fly. This is a product that we developed with Beyond 2020. We developed this product about 8 years ago, and now there are many states that use this product. Here's the link to it, and I know that when Lisa publishes this, you'll be able to see the complete link. We analyze data using the Vermont Crime Online product, and here's an example. Here's a table that we created just with a couple of clicks for assault offenses involving an intimate relationship between the offender and the victim, and we looked at age. So this is an effective tool for us that gives raw numbers and percentages to do quick analysis. Now, one of the things that we find is that that's fine if you are doing analysis that's specific to one Nieghbors segment. So there's an arrest segment, there's a victim segment, there's an offender segment. But if you need to join these files, then what you need to do is download the raw data, and we can do that using this product into a CSV, a comma separated value file, or an Excel spreadsheet, and then we import that data into SPSS, which is Statistical Package for the Social Science. It's a stat pack. We then join those cases and do the kind of analysis that I'm going to report on in a minute, such as the regression analysis. So just a high overview in terms of the research methods. This study focuses on the victim, arrestee, and crime circumstances data. What we're going to show you today is focused exclusively on assault offenses, though one of the nice things about Nieghbors is because it identifies cases based upon the victim-offender relationship, you can do a much broader view of what domestic violence is. So you don't have to restrict yourself to assaults. You could look at vandalisms. And if the victim and the defendant were intimate partners, one can assume that that was really a case of domestic violence established in a little bit different way. In terms of victim-offender relationship, we focused exclusively on intimate or family members. The data is based upon 10,000 plus incidents that we looked at between 2007 and 2011, which was the most current data at the time of the research. So let's get to the results in terms of what we found in terms of description for domestic violence, again, to help our domestic violence community related to where crime occurred. Now, one of the drawbacks of Nieghbors is that it does not provide location data, but it does provide a number, an ORI number assigned by the FBI to every law enforcement agency. And so the third and fourth character of that number is a county code. And so by parsing out that information, we could take a look at county data. And as you can see, it's not equally distributed throughout the state. Let's take a look at victim-offender characteristics. Looking at victims and looking at offenders, we see that they match up fairly closely in terms of age, both mean and median. 71% of victims were female, 72% of defendants were male. Vermont is a very homogeneous state racially, so it didn't surprise us that 93% of victims and offenders were white. Only about 2% of victims were African American, Interestingly, African Americans make up a larger proportion of offenders than they do victims. We're also interested in how many persons were under 18, and it was about 12% of these cases were associated with that. We then went to look at a victim-offender relationship, and again, this is built on this Nieghbors capability to look at this relationship. And so in this study, the vast majority of cases were intimate, and in particular, it was a little surprising that the majority of intimate relationships were boyfriend-girlfriend, not spouse or ex-spouses. Nieghbors also allows for an analysis of time of day and date of week. And so one of the questions was, you know, are there certain time periods whereby domestic violence is more prevalent, which is an excellent thing that can be conveyed to law enforcement agencies in terms of their staffing. And what this data seems to suggest is that there's no one day that is has a low level of domestic violence. It happens every day. And what it seems to do is sort of ramp up through the morning and early afternoon and then early evening, except on Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays when those types of incidents happen later in the day, probably because people are staying up later in the day and because they're probably pretty well liquored up by that point in time. The community of domestic violence advocates and service providers were also interested in the notion of injury. And here we looked at the Nieghbors categories of no injury, minor injuries, and serious injuries. And we cross-tabbed that by the nature of the relationship. And unfortunately, all of these relationships experience injuries. What we did notice was that the serious injuries were slightly more likely to happen among intimate partners than they were other groups. Weapon, always a serious concern when we're looking at domestic violence. And in this graphic, we have cross-tabbed weapons against the type of injury. And again, what's not very surprising is that when a deadly weapon is used, there tends to be more serious injury than otherwise. This entry regarding drugs is somewhat unusual to me, and I'm not sure whether it's a data quality issue or not. The argument here is that drugs were used against the other person. I suppose that's possible, and when it's used, apparently there are serious consequences. So that's the sort of the descriptive analysis, and there was more information that we provided to domestic violence agencies, but in the interest of trying to keep your heads off your desks, let's move on to the policy analysis, and in particular, let's take a look at this issue of arrest type. The first question that we asked was, are in fact law enforcement agencies relying primarily on arrests on warrant or arrests without warrant, meaning that they're doing a custodial arrest, or in fact is a certain percentage of those contacts being handled by a citation? We were somewhat startled to see, is indicated in green here, the percentage of cases that ended in citation. And what was even more notable was that sheriff's departments have an even higher percentage of cases that are handled by citation as opposed to the state police and local police. We also wanted to ask the question about whether or not what was driving this was law enforcement agency, or were there variations by county as well. Now, theoretically, if things were uniform across counties, you would see those different colored lines as being pretty straight up and down. But as you can see, they're quite varied. So that activity in these different states, different counties, and we have 14 counties in Vermont, vary in terms of the percentage of cases that are handled by arrests versus citations. Let's look at this issue of victim refusals. Again, what we're talking about here is a situation where there's an initial call, police respond to the scene, and then as the case moves on, the victim declines to prosecute or participate. So what we found here is that these refusals are very closely associated with the state police. Now, when we do a report like this, if it's going to be a policy-related report, what we do before we release it to the public is that we brief the governor's criminal justice cabinet, which is a group made up pretty much of commissioner-level individuals and representatives from other organizations such as the Chiefs Association, Sheriff's Association, and so forth. So as we were doing this presentation, the Commissioner of Public Safety kind of snapped his chair forward and was pretty concerned about this finding. And so here's where we have the meeting of data with practice. And I have to commend the state police. They were very interested in this and were very interested in trying to determine what was this about. They asked us to do some additional research, and this was kind of a useful experience. I used students from my crime analysis course to continue the Nieghbors analysis looking at state police cases. And what we found really was that the function was not so much related to the state police as it was to the location. So as we look at this 10% of cases where there's refusal, they're concentrated in a very limited number of counties. And those counties are in a part of the state that we call the Northeast Kingdom, which is a very rural part of the state. It's a very conservative, one might even say libertarian section of the state where it is perhaps not such a great idea to involve the police in your personal affairs. But very interesting in terms of how this discussion generated some additional research. Again, the question, are these exceptional clearances, are they concentrated, do they vary? And as you can see, again, as we look at the counties, there is some level of disparity between the different counties in terms of these numbers. And for example, here in Caledonia County, Essex County, Orleans County, Orange County is not in the Northeast Kingdom, but is a similar type of county. This is where these types of referrals tend to occur. So let's take a look at the regression analysis for a moment. And we found this to be a particularly fun part of this report because typically when you look at the use of Nieghbors data, when it is used in a report, it tends to be quite descriptive. What's presented there is information about who the offenders are and who the victims are and where do these happen and when do they happen, similar to what we presented at the beginning of this presentation. What we wanted to demonstrate, though, was that Nieghbors data using SPSS capabilities can produce some sophisticated analysis. And in this case, we wanted to do a regression analysis to try to determine if we could predict whether a case would end in physical arrest versus a citation. And we were successful in doing that. What we were able to do was to generate a model that correctly predicted arrests 84% of the time. And what was interesting was that the variables that were related to the predicting of physical arrest were variables that we were pleased to see. So, for example, population density was a variable related to physical arrest, meaning that in areas that are more rural and if the state police are involved, there's a higher likelihood that the case is going to end in arrest, a secure arrest rather than a custodial arrest. It was our opinion that this was the case because in many of these rural areas there tended to be less services available, and so that maybe law enforcement was going to be the only way to intervene in this particular case. Other variables that were important in terms of explaining the variance between different types of arrests was seriousness of the offense. So the more likelihood that this was an aggravated assault, that there was some level of injury or something of this sort, the higher the probability that this was going to end in a custodial arrest. Persons who were drunk, defendants who were drunk were more likely to be arrested. Older defendants were more likely to be taken into custody. If the relationship was intimate versus maybe a immediate family, the defendant was likely to be arrested. When the victim was a female and the offender was a male, custodial arrests were more likely. And then again, this time of day gave us a little bit of pause. Typically, these custodial arrests happen at night, which is a little counterintuitive. Our shift work, our police shifts go down at night, especially for the state police. And so one might think that if the state police were encountering a case like this at 12 o'clock at night, 12 midnight, they might be more likely to cite so that they could go on to the next call. We think, as a result of some minor limited focus group analysis, that again, this drops back to this notion of density, that if all of the other resources are closed because it's the middle of the night, it's more likely that officers are going to aggressively pursue this case than they would be during the daytime, where there might be some types of alternatives that could be used. So as I said, the model predicted arrests in about 84% of the time, which is fairly satisfactory, I think, for social science research. So with that said, Lisa, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Max. And I would like to invite everyone to type in any questions that you may have. And while we're waiting for those to come in, we also have a poll that we would like everyone to respond to before you leave. It's just some basic information about how you came to this webinar, if you are interested in additional webinars, and what kind of information you're interested in. So if you could please take a moment and respond to that. While we are waiting for some of the questions to come in, there were a few questions that were sent to us before the webinar started, so let's start with those. And I think all of these questions are really for both of the presenters. Lieutenant Lyons of the Lexington Division of Police in Kentucky would like to know, given the increased reliance on Nieghbors data across a wide variety of disciplines, how are researchers approaching the disparity in raw data quality, and was data quality a concern for these presentations? Would either of you like to start with that?
I'll be happy to. Data quality is always a concern. We have Nieghbors, and I think this is true, probably most states, allows you to set up a series of fairly good data quality edits. So we feel fairly confident to the extent that we can that the data meet those edits. There's always the possibility of problems beyond those that can be determined by editing, and you sometimes run into those when you do analysis. But I feel like the structure of Nieghbors allows you to do cross-checking that you could not do in other systems. For example, and I'm not the edit expert in our state by any stretch, if you get a simple assault that involves a weapon, either it was mistakenly coded as simple assault or there wasn't a weapon, and that goes back with an error report. So we feel pretty good about the quality of data to the extent that we can control it.
Max, would you like to add anything to that?
I think Rob has hit the nail on the head. I think that Nieghbors data is, without question, the most valid police-related data to use, in large part because of the auditing. Information that comes from computer-created dispatch records management systems in most police departments is not regularly audited for data quality. It's only because of the framework of Nieghbors that there are auditors in each law enforcement agency as well as at the state level to check the data quality of those records.
Thank you. We have had a couple of questions come in that go back to kind of the basics of what Nieghbors is. And just to give a quick overview, Nieghbors is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and it is a system of data collected by the FBI. And this differs a little bit from UCR reporting traditionally, because traditional reporting was just crime counts. And just very quickly, Nieghbors is an improvement on that in many aspects, in that it collects information on the victim, it collects information on the offender if they're known, it collects property information, it also collects arrestee information, and so there are a lot of variables within this system that the traditional UCR summary system did not collect. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of that for some of the folks who have posted some questions. All right, Rob, we also have a question that someone would like you just to review very quickly, the relative rate index.
Sure. This is a measurement that I believe is mandated for our reporting to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And it's very simply, it reflects the percentage that a group of interest, in our case we use usually the Black, Hispanic, and aggregate Hispanic categories as the groups of interest, has compared to the white kids. So a relative rate index of 1 means that they were equal. A relative rate index greater than 1 means that the interest group had a rate higher, and it reflects the degree to which it was higher. In our case, for Black kids, it was 2.8, I believe, which means that their arrest rate was 2.8 times that of the white kids. And if it's lower than 1, then that reflects the percentage that it is of the white kids' arrest rate. I believe Hispanic kids had a RRI of 0.8 in our state for this time, and that reflects the fact that their arrest rate is 80% of the arrest rate that white kids had. I believe I got that right, but hopefully someone is checking behind me.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, we had another question come in for you, Rob, also. Is it possible that Hispanic juveniles are being dealt with primarily by ICE and not with law enforcement?
That's certainly possible. And I don't believe, and that raises a good question that I don't have the answer to. I don't believe, but I'm not certain that arrests carried out strictly by federal agencies are reported. So I can't say that definitively, but I believe that's the case unless a local agency is involved, local or state agency. I don't believe it would be involved there. So yeah, that's certainly possible, and it's certainly possible that if that's the case, that we're not getting those. I think that's a very good question and something we need to look at a little closer.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Mr. Jones in Miami. Where can analysts find incident-based data from across jurisdictions? And do either of your states provide these kinds of data to researchers?
I'll go ahead first. In South Carolina, it's simply on a as requested basis. Anyone can request access to it, and usually if you can make a good case that you know what you're doing, they'll let you have access to it. Their biggest concern is giving it out and having it misinterpreted, so they have some concerns in that area.
Right. How about in Vermont, Max?
In Vermont, our Nieghbors data is available publicly on the Vermont Crime Online site, which is part of the Department of Public Safety. Our Nieghbors site is managed by the Vermont Crime Information Center. Amy Messier, I noticed, is on the call from Vermont. She is the state's auditor, Nieghbors auditor. So if you go to our site, you can see this data and you can manipulate it to develop custom tables. We did that in order for a couple of things. Number one, to give the public the opportunity to see this data. We also, frankly, used it as an incentive for law enforcement agencies to increase their data quality, because their data was out there, is being used, and of course they now had a very important vested interest in making sure the data quality was good.
Thank you, Max.
I could just add again, I believe, and Lisa, you probably know better than I that this data can be made available in data sets from the Criminal Justice Archive at the University of Michigan. Am I right?
Yes, you can download the FBI's national level data directly, and they actually have an analysis tool online as well. I've never used the analysis tool, but you can actually go on and ask for specific tables to be built rather than downloading the whole data set, or you can download the whole data set as well. Those data will probably differ a little bit from the state level data because they've gone through, you know, the data quality checks that the FBI does, and their cutoffs for inclusion in that are a little different. But the national level data set is indeed available. Okay, we also had a question that came in on how many states are reporting Nieghbors data, and the last information that we have is actually from 2012, but there were 32 states that were certified to collect and report incident-based data to the FBI. 15 of those are 100% reporting, so all of the agencies in this state are reporting. And one thing to keep in mind is that if a state is certified, that could mean that one agency is reporting, that could mean that 300 agencies are reporting. And one of the biggest issues that Nieghbors has had has been getting the largest law enforcement agencies on board. So states that are certified may only have 20% of their crime being reported through Nieghbors. So just because a state is reported does not mean they do have full coverage. So I just wanted to bring that up as well. All right, so we have a couple of other questions. We have one that is, again, for you, Rob.
Okay.
I can't see at the moment. Hold on just one second. Okay, do you find that your information from South Carolina matched well with the DMC categories from OJDAP? And if not, how did you address that issue?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, yes, it did match very well with what they were looking for in terms of the racial and ethnic groups among juveniles, because we were able to use, fortunately, Nieghbors and Nieghbors, of course, as well, collects both race and ethnicity different, and that allowed us to create that racial ethnic group where Hispanics were counted solely as Hispanics and non-Hispanics were categories according to their racial identification. Is that the question that?
That sounds good to me.
Okay.
All right, so the next question we have is for both of you. Both presenters mentioned a third type of arrest as citation or ticket. Does this mean that offenders are issued money fines for potentially serious offenses such as domestic violence? Or is this also an arrest type that could mean a summons to court?
In South Carolina, it just simply means it's a summons for court. There's no on-site fines levied. Again, I'm not sure I'm answering the question correctly, but that's the situation here.
That's the same. The word citation, I think, is based on the notion of a traffic citation, but it's not a ticket in the sense of you pay $220 and get out of jail free. What it is it's an order to appear in court to respond to the charge. And the difference is that issued at the time, the defendant is not necessarily arrested and removed from the site, which is why it's of concern to domestic violence advocates. That person, once cited, could subsequently be put on probation, or they may be sentenced to a short period of time followed by probation. I mean, citation does not limit the nature of the sentence. In fact, sort of an outgrowth of this project was to take these cases and track them through the court to see whether or not we could see a relationship between citations versus the notion of what the sentence is. You know, there's been a lot of research that shows that when defendants show up in court in orange jumpsuits, their dispositions are not quite as favorable as when somebody shows up in a three-piece suit. So sort of the question was, if the police are issuing a citation, are they, in a sense, telegraphing a message to the judge, state's attorney about how they construe the seriousness of this offense? That report's not quite yet published.
Thank you, Max. And we have another question for you. Was the regression model a single level or a multi-level model, and were any of the variables significant?
It was a multi-level model, and there were a number of variables that were significant. And I wish I could provide you more detail, but our senior principal investigator on this project, Robin Weber, was not able to be with us today, and I'm embarrassed to say that question is a little over my head in terms of the detail that I have available today.
All right, thank you. And we have, let's see, a couple more questions. And I believe this is probably for both of you. What techniques do you use or do you suggest to help police agencies report juvenile arrests correctly, i.e. include custody-only events?
Well, I'm going to jump right in on that because we have a mechanism here in South Carolina. The State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, is responsible for collecting and maintaining this data, and part of what they do in connection with that responsibility is they do constant training. I think that's probably the best method of making sure that any sort of questions like that are addressed and that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. That and auditing. But the problem with auditing this is you really don't have any other cross-checks that I can think of that you would be able to do for that. So in this case, I think training, which they take very seriously here, is probably the best remedy.
And I would agree with Rob. In Vermont, we do similar things. We have within the Department of Children and Family Services a juvenile justice, a disproportionate minority contact monitor, and that person's job is to look, see where there are disproportionate issues at police departments, and they pay visits to those departments to try to determine, are they data quality issues or are they an issue that really needs to be addressed. And so they do a lot of training. They make those site visits.
All right, thank you very much. And then we have quite a few more questions. I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of them, but this one is also for both of you. Do the presenters have any examples of using this kind of analytical tool with court data?
I'll reiterate what I spoke of just a moment ago. It's very valuable to link Nieghbors data to court data, because what you're able to do then is you get some sort of a sense of throughput in terms of how these cases move through the system. We do that by linking the case number that is part of Nieghbors, it's associated with that data set, with the case number that is included in the data set for the court for each of their dockets. So we found this not to be that difficult, but it is really very valuable in terms of looking at this kind of analysis as to how cases move through the system.
And I'll respond first with extreme jealousy over Max's success in that regard. We have tried that, and we have been very unsuccessful in doing that. We also have on court dockets a space, a field, if you will, for case number. But in attempts to do this same sort of linking that Max is talking about, we have found that it's very underutilized. And basically it's underutilized because it's not an important field to anyone in the court process. They really don't, it doesn't hurt their, it's not an essential data element. It doesn't hurt anything if it's not there. So in different efforts that we have done over the years, we've found no more than 25% in any set of circumstances that we were interested in of the court dockets had case numbers that would have allowed us to link to Nieghbors, and in some circumstances far less. It's a real unfortunate situation that we have here. We would be able to do much more interesting analysis, much more important analysis if that data was available, but it's not.
Follow up on Rob, the way we handle that in Vermont, we're very fortunate to have a centralized court system, a unified court system. So we have a court administrator who's responsible for managing all of the superior court to handle criminal. And they have a standardized data format, which I have to, again, give them a lot of credit. Whenever they do any types of changes in their database, they include all the stakeholders in those discussions. So there's some kind of argument that says, well, Vermont Crime Information Center needs an arrest case number on a docket, and they'll include that in their management information system. So I would say that 100% of docket information contains a police case number.
And I think that Max's analysis there is exactly on point. That points out the importance of governance of any information system. And we simply did not, at some point when the court docket process was being set up, somebody got the point in that we should have that information available, but nobody got the point across that this was going to be important down the line. And it just simply isn't something that gets, the absence of that information isn't something that gets a record kicked back for an error report. And I don't know at this point what we can do about that.
Thank you, and I appreciate all of the questions. I think we only have time for one more, and this question is again for both of you. How do you disseminate your findings to both law enforcement agencies and state policymakers, and what response have you seen from either?
I'll give this a start. We have a website that appeared on most of our slides, www.vcjr.org, www.vcjr.org. So we post all of our reports on that site. We have a blog that we announce any type of report when it comes out. We have one of our network stations does local programming, and one of the things I do is I have a regular segment on that. It's sort of an interview show where we talk about reports that we issue. And this is it's pretty challenging to be able to provide in 5 minutes the guts of a report in a way that somebody watching the show, which ramps up to the 6 o'clock news, is going to be interested in. We get a lot of positive feedback on that. We do news releases, and of course we do, whenever we get a chance, any presentations at the chief's meetings, the sheriff's meetings. We, as I mentioned earlier, we present to our criminal justice cabinet. The bottom line is that unless reports are disseminated, their value is limited. And then this sort of has a self-reinforcing quality to it, because as people see that you're using their data and it's being used in a meaningful way for the legislature, for the executive branch, for the courts, and again, the incentive for data quality rises every time we issue a new report.
And I've seen Max's presentations on TV, and frankly, I would hate to have to follow him. He does quite a job on that. We follow a very similar, although perhaps not quite as ambitious process. I think Max is exactly right. If you don't get the information to the right people's hands, it has no value whatsoever, and we put a great deal of effort into that. We also posted on our website, which I'm embarrassed to say I don't know off the top of my head, but I know you can find it on JRSA's website on the little state there that's South Carolina. We do news releases as well. We try to, although printing is getting more and more expensive and funds are becoming fewer and far between for it, we will print limited copies and send them out to key players. If we were doing a report like Max's on domestic violence, we would probably send it to people in the victim advocacy community. Doing a report like this on juvenile justice, we made sure that the governor's council, I can't remember the name of it, but basically that council that every state is required to have to oversee the dissemination of OJJDP funds, we made sure it got in their hands. So we follow a very similar process of trying to make sure we hit those groups that should be particularly interested in it and make it as widely known that it's available out there on the website as we can.
And have either of you seen any direct policy response based on these or similar reports?
Keep trying to make eye contact with Max to see who wants to go first, but it hasn't worked so far. I think when you get that in the right people's hands, the people who have interest in it take it. We've had reports that have gone before the legislature to committees on that particular topic. We've had agencies adopt policies as a result of it. It doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes it's not practical to expect it to, but we've seen real results from it.
I would say the same, and I think part of it has to do with the topic that you select. And there has to be some sort of political savvy in terms of what you apply for grants for, what you do research on, because there are some topics that nobody cares about, and you may do a fabulous report, but it's not going to go anywhere. On the other hand, if you're picking a topic that is being discussed in the legislature, the governors and his people are concerned about, and you can deliver the product in a timely way, I think you have a much higher probability that your work is actually going to become part of the discussion.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to thank both of our speakers, Rob McManus and Max Schluter, as well as everyone who joined us today. I'd also like to invite you to download these reports and other similar reports from the JRSA website. We have a wealth of information and reports related to incident-based data, and hopefully you will join us for future webinars. Thank you very much.